I'm about to go back on one of the big statements that I had made not too long ago. Here we go. You remember when I said that Thundering Fury Cloran was significantly better than Whimsy Cloran? Without question, in fact, because it's just much more fun to play than Whimsy Cloran. Well, I'm not exactly going back on that particular judgment. I still maintain that position for pretty much almost every team. But I think it's time we actually recognize that, of course, there were some teams that exist, especially these days, that do lean more towards the idea of using Whimsy Cloran, not necessarily because you want to do more damage, but only because the major positive aspects of Thundering Fury Cloran don't really have a role to play in those teams. And one of those teams actually involves playing Aggravate Cloran, which you would think is something that TF Cloran excels at, but specifically with Iansan. There is a rotation with Aggravate Cloran that actually works perfectly with Whimsy. It is to, let's say, well, my personal favorite version of this team would be to run Cloran, Shillidan, Iansan, and Nahida. And the rotation is quite literally to go backwards. We start with Nahida, into Iansan, into Shillidan, into Cloran, and after Cloran's finished popping off and using her ult, we start again. We go into Nahida, etc, etc, etc. And the reason why my rotation in this particular regard is made that way is because, of course, then I'm also making use of C2 Shillidan by the way of getting Iansan's ult to come back even faster. Obviously, if you don't have C2 Shillidan, then you can potentially put Shillidan before Iansan if you want, because in a team like this, you're definitely going to be running Scroll on Iansan, which means it doesn't really matter when Iansan's part of the rotation kicks in. And if you don't have C2 Shillidan, and even better, if you don't have C4 Iansan, you probably do want to actually go Nahida into Shillidan, or Shillidan into Nahida, into Iansan, and then into Cloran, because that'll be a lot easier to maintain Iansan's buff meter above that 42 Night Soul mark. And of course, if you do have C4 Iansan, and hell, if you have C6 Iansan, there is a pretty good opportunity for you to even get the C6 part of C6 Iansan to work as well, which is of course additional damage. And this is of course a rotation where the setup after you're done popping off with Cloran is just long enough that you are able to start using Cloran's skill again as soon as you get back to her. And that's regardless of whether or not you pop Nahida's ult or whether or not you pop Shillidan's ult. Doesn't seem to matter for the most part. If you go Nahida's skill and Shillidan's skills only, as long as you're still doing Iansan's skill ult, which you of course should, then yes, this is a team where Whimsy actually ends up being the way to go, because if you run TF, then you end up with a lot of time where Cloran's skill is already off cooldown while you're setting up the team again. Of course, if you are playing TF, there is of course another kind of rotation that I have been trying out. It's not perfect, but it is kind of funny. The only major problem with it is that Iansan's ult doesn't last long enough in order for you to do two full rounds at the very least, of Cloran's DPS. But you're still able to use, I think, about half of the second round of Cloran's DPS being buffed by Iansan. And so the rotation in that particular regard is to go, Nahida into Shillidan into Iansan, and then you start popping off with Cloran, you use Cloran's ult, then you start popping off again, and as long as you're running TF Cloran, this is of course going to be a rotation where you could just go straight into the next round of Cloran's just DPS window. So if that's something you want to do, yes, this is of course going to be a moment where TF is still better than Whimsy. But in the grand scheme of things, I think just having that very normal rotation for Aggravate Cloran with Iansan does lend much better for any Whimsy players out there. So look, I am nothing if not fair, okay? Look, I still maintain that TF Cloran is better than Whimsy, but for the Whimsy heads out there, this is something that I personally have found quite a lot of enjoyment in playing. So, hey, there we go. And then of course, on top of that, the other team that Whimsy is actually better than TF in is Overload Cloran. This is probably like the only team where TF Cloran doesn't work all that much, because it's hard to maintain a Pyro Aura for TF Cloran to work unless you're running double Pyro, in which case that's or rather triple pyro, in which case that's a bit excessive. So yeah, putting that aside, if you're playing like the nowadays standard Overload Cloran team, the quote-unquote meta Cloran team with Mawika, then yeah, Whimsy is the way to go because you're just not going to get TF to work all that much. And so, look, again, I just want to make it absolutely perfectly clear. If you can get TF Cloran, I highly recommend you get TF Cloran. Why is that? Because I feel like there's more teams where you have a much better time playing TF Cloran than Whimsy Cloran. Namely, Aggravate Cloran with Sarah, Quick Bloom Cloran, especially with Farina, the various other random Aggravate Cloran teams with other characters like Mika, for example, or something like that. Hell, even any Aggravate Cloran team with Fischl where you're not too fussed about other durations. Yeah, TF Cloran is the way to go. But with Whimsy Cloran, I think there's mainly two teams where you actually have quite a lot of legitimate reasons to go for Whimsy Cloran besides quote-unquote more damage, and that is Aggravate Cloran with Iansan and Overload Cloran, the variations of Overload Cloran in particular, of which I don't think there's as many variations of Overload Cloran as there are variations of Quicken and Quick Bloom Cloran as well. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. One other thing as well, I don't know if I ever mentioned this, if you are playing Aggravate Cloran with Shillidan, or hell, if you're playing Overload Cloran with Mawika, consider Maiden's Beloved on Shillidan or Chevrus, because remember, Cloran's personal healing that makes her Omega tanky actually scales massively because of how it actually works with healing bonus and incoming healing bonus, which is exactly what Maiden's Beloved is. So when you are in a team with, let's say, Iansan, who's already running Scroll, you have no reason to run Scroll on Shillidan, aside from maybe if you only have one artifact set that's built for Peak Patrol Song. Putting that aside, consider Maiden's Beloved. Trust me, your Cloran will be basically nigh unkillable. Almost nigh unkillable. Alright, hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact action. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye!
Shoot on sight. You asked for it. Faster, stronger. Start the light of the blazing sun. Full throttle. Moving. Full speed ahead. Time. Let's look.